and good evening all. Since we all know exactly what's coming after last Friday's video, let's get straight into the Porsche 907. As a quick aside, I don't have any of my own photos of the 907, as with allegedly only 12 units produced, they aren't exactly cropping up at every weekend track day and car show adjacent to the local village fete, so we'll be using some archival photos and some Assetto Corsa footage as filler. This does not in any way indicate a pivot away from the use of my own photography in other videos, but rather stands as a commitment to following through with an overarching project. On with the video. Porsche had been making substantial progress in their quest for ever greater racing glory over the preceding few years. The 904 and 906 had earned regular hill climb and class victories, and the 910 had taken Porsche's first overall victory in a major circuit race, with its result in the 1967 1,000 kilometers of the Nürburgring. At the time, Porsche was introducing either a new model variant or an entirely new model of race car every few months, and even before the 910's shining moment, work had commenced on its replacement, set to debut at that year's Le Mans. With typical German sensibility, the new model was called the 907, which I suppose almost relegates the 910 to something approaching submodel designation of the 906. Anyway, the 907 Longtail, Langheck, debuted at Le Mans as the first version of the car, still a mechanical continuation of the design principles promulgated in the 906 and 910. There was a tubular space frame chassis with internal plumbing for oil cooling, double wishbone suspension with front and rear coils, hydraulic disc brakes that were ventilated on all four wheels, improving on the front axle ventilation of the 910. Carried over too were the center-locking 13-inch magnesium wheels and the 220-horsepower 2-liter air-cooled Boxer 6 that had been a stalwart of the model family since the later 904s. There were also, as usual, occasional uses of the larger 2.2-liter Flat 8, still sporting its reliability issues, with both power plants sending power to the rear wheels through a 5-speed manual transmission with a limited slip diff. Honestly, y'all probably could have written all that out from memory based on the last couple of videos, but if that was your remit, there'd be no need for me then, would there? What changed the most from the 910 was the bodywork. Particularly in the debut Langheck, the emphasis shifted towards streamlining for high-speed operations. Both the front and rear of the car were lengthened relative to the outgoing model, with the 906's rear plastic engine cover making a reappearance on the Longtail cars. The cabin, like the entire car, was narrower as well, with the windshield stretched longer to minimize drag, but it was also taller than necessary from a design perspective, built instead to meet regulations on a minimum height. Nevertheless, these changes combined to create the lowest drag Porsche yet, and were critical to give the car a chance against the more powerful Fords and Ferraris that were moving into Porsche's competitive focus as they set their sights on winning the World Championship outright. This ambition received some help from the 1968 season, which we'll get to in a moment. One other change that's noteworthy but doesn't inherently fit into any other categories was the swap to right-hand drive, the first instance of this for a racing Porsche, and a change implemented to take advantage of the fact that most circuits ran in a clockwise direction, and being seated on the right greatly improved driver visibility and arguably weight distribution for cornering. We were finally reaching a point where Porsche's prototype design couldn't really be improved further through simple weight reduction, and for the first time in our story, we're actually seeing weight gain over the 910, with the 907 LH tipping the scales at about 70 kilos heavier than its predecessor, coming in at 650 kgs, or 1,433 pounds. Nevertheless, the top speed improved to about 190 miles an hour, or 305 kph, about 5 miles per hour more than the 910/8 with the same engine. Aero does make a difference. And indeed, aero does make a difference. In its debut at the Le Mans test day in 1967, the Longtail cars were found to be incredibly difficult to drive at high speeds, a problem that would plague the 917 in its early form as well, due to aerodynamic instabilities that were not perfectly understood at the time. The cabin was also incredibly hot while running. Porsche had neglected to integrate any meaningful mechanism for cabin ventilation for some reason, perhaps forgetting that the 910 hadn't needed it only because it had a fully removable roof. And thus, with a Boxer 6 or 8 right behind the driver, never mind one that relies entirely on the air around it to dissipate heat, this created less than comfortable conditions for the driver from both the heat and the intrusion of exhaust gases from that engine enclosure. For the race itself, the 907s arrived sporting a rear spoiler and additional cooling snorkels for the engine bay and gearbox, while cabin cooling remained insufficient until 1968. Le Mans that year was a qualified success. Two of the new 907s were entered, with Jochen Rindt and Gerhard Mitter out after about 6 hours with a broken cam, but Joe Siffert and Hans Hermann drove their car home to a 5th place overall and first in class victory, also taking the index of performance with a fuel consumption figure of 14.51 liters per 100 kilometers. Quite good compared to the contemporaneous V8s and V12s of other manufacturers who shall remain nameless. Actually, if I've done my calculations correctly, it's a remarkably good figure full stop, as the TS030 hybrid was burning about 3 times that, 42.82 liters per 100 kilometers, assuming 70 liters out of a 73-liter fuel tank per 12-lap stint on a 13.629-kilometer track, that being the length of the Circuit de la Sarthe, in 2013. For the Americans among us, that's 16.2 miles to the gallon for the 907 versus just shy of 5 for the TS030. Of course, the Audi diesels of similar vintage were similar vintage to the 030 and not to the 907, were of course a bit more circumspect with their fuel consumption, but still tended to land, I believe, somewhere around 8 or 9 miles to the gallon in the same year. Anyway, the instability of the long-tail cars caused a minor revision to the rear bodywork for the car's only other entry that year at Brands Hatch, in which it came fourth. But 1968 saw some major changes for both the 907 and the World Sports Car Championship. The FIA had changed the rules, quelle surprise, and the largest engined prototypes from Ford and Ferrari were no longer legal, with power plant displacement capped at 5 liters for prototypes that had more than 50 units produced, this allowance a move to try and keep fields fleshed out while manufacturers built new cars otherwise, and all others were capped at 3 liters. Ferrari, as usual, gave up in protest and bowed out of the prototype game for a bit. Ford produced a few more GT40s by mid-year to allow the smaller-engined 4.5-ish liter cars to compete. Some ran 4.7-liter engines, and enough Lola T70s had been built by that time to put them in the mix as well in the above 3-liter class. Everyone else, including Ford, pivoted to the 3-liter class or stayed in 2.0, with vehicles such as the P68, arguably Ford's finest styling effort to date, but hardly their best mechanical one. Alfa and Renault Alpine started to rework their 2-liter vehicles to compete under the new rule set, also keeping standard 2-liter vehicles in class, though not always with great success. Thus, apart from the legacy GT40s, Porsche looked to be in with a shout of their first world championship for 1968. Additional work was being carried out to shorten the 907's rear bodywork in pursuit of improved stability, but for the start of the season, the 907 LH took center stage, with 5 entries at the season-opening 24 Hours of Daytona, 1 6-cylinder engined car backing up the 4 factory 8-bangers. Allegedly, the Porsche team had also managed to wrangle another great Florida-based organization, NASA, into helping out with the cooling issues in the 907's cabin, debuting a prototype cool suit inspired by the LCVGs then in use by the Apollo astronauts for their rather more cosmic sojourns. As with the naming stories on last week's video, I've only found one source that actually makes this claim, so it's possible that it's apocryphal, but I grew up as a spacehead, so actually I'm still a spacehead, but in more ways than one, but it's a good story, so I'm sticking it in here. Despite a strong challenge from the Ford GTs at the Daytona race and the loss of 2 of the 907s, the 3 remaining cars staged a line-abreast run for the last moments of the race, with the number 54 originally of Vic Elford and Jochen Nierpasch, joined with 3 more co-drivers, those being Rolf Stommelin, Hans Hermann, and Joe Siffert, all atop the podium after they all did time in the car while their original cars were retired or repaired. Herren, Hermann, and Siffert occupied the second step of the podium in their own right with the number 952 car, while the Joe Schlesser and Joe Buzetta piloted number 51 completed the Porsche sweep of the season opener's podium. The short-tailed 907K debuted at Sebring that year, running 1-2 ahead of 2 Penske Racing Camaros and setting Porsche up as arguable favorites for Le Mans, furthered by repeat victories at the Targa Florio and 1,000 kilometers of the Ring, the latter actually coming from a 908 in its debut race, but finishes behind Dearborn's Bruiser at Brands Hatch and Monza meant that while the GT40s lacked some of the punch of their previous season, they still had plenty of staying power. Le Mans that year did not go the way of the Porsches. Despite those most typical of French summertime activities, strikes and protests, delaying the race until September and allowing Porsche time to debut and nominally improve the new 908, the interceding months had seen the championship draw to neck and neck between Porsche and Ford, with the factory efforts of the latter now run by John Wyer's team, wearing the now iconic Gulf Oil livery. Channel favorite, the Helmet TX, was at the race too, with 2 entries from Mr. Ray Hebenstall. But it didn't do very well. The race started actually badly for the Fords when a privately entered GT40 driven by Willy Maires crashed on the opening lap. In a rush to get off the line, he failed to close his door properly, and it flew open while the car was heading down the Mulsanne for the first time, causing Maires to lose control and crash into the trees. He survived, but he was comatose for 2 weeks and never raced again. Porsche, on the other hand, had the pace at the front of the field, and the 4 factory 908s battled amongst themselves for the lead, starting to lap the back of the field by lap 4. Yes, this is still a 907 video. In all, only one of the factory cars would finish, with electrical issues plaguing the others and taking out both the Busetta Patrick and Mitter Elford cars around hour 9, the latter due to a rules disqualification when they swapped an alternator, although if they hadn't swapped it, their race would have been over anyway, so... The other car was out with clutch failure at hour 5, and so the only one of the factory Porsches, driven by Herren Nierpasch and Stommelen, finished a rather disappointing 3rd that year, behind Pedro Rodriguez and Lucien Bianchi's John Wyer Ford GT40, and a Swiss privateer 907 Langkek that, despite being a reserve entry, surpassed all expectations to put Hans-Heinrich Steinemann and Dieter Spory 2nd overall, and atop the 3-liter prototype podium. This meant that Ford again won the World Championship, as well as a 3-peat at Le Mans, and the remaining 907s in Porsche's possession were sold off to other privateers at the end of the season, supplanted in less than a year and a half by the 908, which enjoyed even less time in the limelight, as Porsche had already started work on their ultimate racing machine, the 917. That sounds a bit Bavarian somehow. 907s in private hands performed well in 1969 and 70, taking class wins at Sebring and the Ring, and the Wiki Racing team carried on until 1972 with the car, finally sunsetting it after Le Mans that year. Given Porsche's tendency to iterate on model designs so aggressively at the time, and a surprisingly non-Germanic approach to records keeping, anywhere between the aforementioned dozen cars and possibly as many as 21 were manufactured, but most sources agree that at most 12 survived the last 5.5 decades. Needless to say, it takes deep pockets and substantive patience to lay hands on one these days, and they aren't quite as common at historic events. If any viewers happen to just, have one taking up space in the garage, do get in touch, if only so I can come photograph it, interview you about it, and perhaps gaze longingly at it through a camera lens. That brings us to the end of another video. As always, thank you for watching, and for this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube:
like, comment, subscribe.
If any of you, dear viewers, happen to share my passion for road cycling and have a bit of extra money in your budget this month, I cannot, #notspawned, recommend the Continental GP5000s highly enough. I switched to them a couple weeks ago after using gator skins for many years, and good lord, what an improvement. In the eternal words of Ferris Bueller, if you have the means, I highly recommend picking one up. Or 2, actually, because they're tires and they go on a bicycle. That just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you're watching, and to wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.